My father betrayed me for being a woman and gave my law firm to my incompetent brother. I quit instantly. But when we faced each other in court, I destroyed him so brutally that now he's begging me to come back and take what was always mine. I'm 26 years old. I'm a Harvard-educated lawyer with honors. And 6 months ago, my father told me I would never run the family firm because I was born with the wrong chromosome. Like that, literally. Well, he didn't use those exact words, but that's basically what it was. And the worst part, what really hurt me to my soul, is that he was going to hand everything over to Connor, my younger brother who barely managed to graduate from a state university and who doesn't have half my experience or preparation. I guess I should start at the beginning. When this whole becoming a lawyer thing was just a dream I shared with my dad in his study while he reviewed cases and I pretended to read his giant legal books. I was like 6 or 7 years old and I already knew I wanted to be like him. You know, Howard Montgomery? The legendary Dallas lawyer who won impossible cases and whose name was in gold letters on one of the most important buildings downtown. My mother, Claire, was always the total opposite of my father, like the perfect 50s housewife, but in the 21st century. You know what I mean? She never worked, never questioned anything, just nodded and smiled and made sure the house was spotless and dinner was ready at 7 o'clock sharp. I remember once, I must have been like 10 years old. I asked her why she had never worked, and she said something that stuck with me. She said her job was to take care of us, that was the most important thing a woman could do. Even then, being a kid, something about that answer made me uncomfortable. Connor was born when I was 4 years old, and from the beginning, he was the golden child, the male heir my father always wanted, though he never said it explicitly. It's not that he treated me badly or anything. Honestly, my dad was always affectionate with me. He supported me when I decided to study law, paid for Harvard without blinking, told me he was proud when I graduated summa cum laude, but there was something, a subtle difference in how he talked about our futures. When I got A's, he'd say, "Well done, honey." When Connor barely passed with C's, my father would say things like, "Well, men mature later, you'll see he'll find his way." And Connor found his way, I guess, if studying law at a mediocre university because dad made a generous donation counts as finding your way. He graduated 3 years ago, with barely decent grades, no honors, no distinctions, nothing special. By that point, I had already been working at the family firm for 2 years, at Montgomery and Associates, winning cases, building my reputation, working like 12 hours a day to prove I deserved to be there. The thing is, I always assumed, always took for granted, that someday the firm would be mine. Not Connor's. Mine. Because I was the oldest, because I was a better lawyer, because I had dedicated my entire life to preparing for that moment. Connor didn't even want to be a lawyer. Honestly, I remember conversations where he said he preferred business, investments, things like that. But Dad insisted he study law, that it was the family tradition, that Montgomery and Associates needed a Montgomery at the helm. And I thought, perfect, because I'm a Montgomery too, right? But turns out not the right kind of Montgomery. 6 months ago, my father called us to a family dinner. Nothing out of the ordinary. We had dinner together every Sunday at the family home, that huge mansion on the outskirts of Dallas with more rooms than we needed. Mom had made roast beef, Dad's favorite, and Connor arrived late as always, smelling slightly of beer. I remember thinking, this idiot comes half drunk to a family dinner and nobody says anything. If it had been me, my father would have made a comment. But no. Connor sat down and Mom served him without a word. After dessert, Dad cleared his throat in that way he has when he's going to say something important. You know, that moment where everyone goes quiet and pays attention. And he said, "I'm 67 years old. It's time to think about the future of the firm, about who's going to take the reins when I retire." My heart started beating faster because this was what I had been waiting for. This was the conversation we needed to have. And then he said, "I've decided that Connor will be the next senior partner at Montgomery and Associates." I sat there, fork still in my hand, trying to process what I had just heard. Connor seemed as surprised as I was. Honestly, he straightened up in his chair and said something like, "Wow, Dad, I don't know what to say." And I still couldn't speak. I literally felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Finally, I managed to say, "Wait, what?" And Dad looked at me with that paternal and condescending expression I hate and said, "Sarah, honey, you knew this was going to happen eventually." And I said, "No, honestly, I didn't. I thought the firm would go to whoever was most qualified, who had worked hardest, who really deserved it. Mom touched my arm, like telling me to calm down, but I was furious. Like a fury I had never felt before. I told Dad, Connor barely has 3 years of experience. He's lost more cases than he's won. The partners constantly complain about his lack of preparation. And Dad simply said, he'll mature, he'll learn, but we need a man at the helm, Sarah. Clients expect that. It's tradition. That's when I understood it. When reality hit me with full force. It didn't matter how hard I worked, how many cases I won, how many hours I dedicated. It was never going to be enough, because I didn't have a penis. That simple, that ridiculous, that unfair. I asked him directly, this is because I'm a woman, right? And I expected him to deny it, to give me some reason that made at least a little sense. But no. He looked at me and said, the business world is tough, Sarah, especially for women, and I want to protect you from that. I want you to have an easier life. As if handing over my inheritance to my incompetent brother was some kind of favor he was doing me. I told him, I don't need your protection. I need you to recognize my work, my talent, my dedication. And he simply shook his head and said, I've made my decision. I hope you'll respect it. I got up from the table. My legs were shaking, but I managed to stay steady. Connor wasn't saying anything, just staring at his plate as if it had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. Mom was begging me to sit down, to talk calmly, but I was already walking toward the door. Dad called out to me, said Sarah, don't be dramatic. And that was what finished breaking something in me. I turned around and told him, dramatic? Really? I studied at Harvard. I graduated with highest honors. I've won 87% of my cases in 3 years, and I'm being dramatic for expecting that to matter? For expecting a minimum of recognition? And I left that house with the certainty that something fundamental had changed between us, something that might never be repairable. I spent that night at my apartment, a small but nice place downtown Dallas that I had bought with my own money, without help from Dad, because I wanted to prove I could do it alone. I didn't sleep at all. Honestly. I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the times I had ignored the signs, all the little things I should have noticed. Like when Dad introduced me to important clients, he always said, this is my daughter, Sarah. She's an excellent lawyer. But when he introduced Connor, he said, this is my son, Connor. Someday he'll run the firm. Or, like when I won an important case, Dad would congratulate me in private, but when Connor won anything, however insignificant, Dad would send an email to the entire firm celebrating it. Little things that alone didn't mean much, but together painted a very clear picture of how my father really saw us. The next morning, I went to the firm, arrived early as always, and started packing my things. I had a nice office on the 15th floor, with a view of the city, photos of my won cases on the walls, my Harvard diploma in an elegant frame. I was putting everything in boxes when Dad came in, didn't even knock on the door. He said, what are you doing? And I told him, I'm leaving. I'm resigning. I'm not going to stay in a place where my work is worthless. He tried to convince me to stay, said I could continue being a partner, that I would have an important role under Connor's leadership, and I laughed because it was so absurd I couldn't help it. I told him, no, Dad, I'm not going to work for Connor. I'm not going to be his subordinate when I'm a better lawyer than he is, and we both know it. And he got angry, raised his voice and said I was being immature, that I was throwing my career out the window out of pride. I finished packing, called 2 partners who had always supported me to say goodbye, and left Montgomery and Associates for the last time as an employee. Mom called me like 50 times that day, left crying, messages, saying I was breaking Dad's heart. Please reconsider, that family was the most important thing. But I had already made my decision. If Dad wasn't going to recognize my value, I would find someone who would. It wasn't hard to get a job. Honestly, with my resume and my record of 1 cases, in 2 weeks I had 3 offers from important firms in Dallas. I chose a medium-sized but very respected firm, Hartman and Associates. Mainly because the senior partner, Peter Jackson, a guy in his 50s with gray hair and an impeccable reputation, said something in the interview that resonated with me. He said, Sarah, I hired my daughter as a partner 5 years ago because she's brilliant, not because she's my daughter. And if you're half as good as they say, you'll be an invaluable asset to this firm. I started the following Monday, with a smaller office than I had, but with something much more valuable. respect. About 3 months passed. I was working on several cases, building relationships with new clients, proving my worth. I hadn't spoken to Dad since I resigned. Mom would call occasionally to try to get us to have dinner, but I always had excuses. Connor sent me a message once, something brief like, "Hey, I miss working with you. We should talk." But I didn't respond. The truth is, I was angry with him too. Because even though it wasn't his fault for being the male heir, he could have declined the offer. He could have said no. This isn't fair to Sarah. But he didn't. He accepted something he didn't deserve without questioning anything. One day, Peter called me to his office. He had that smile he gets when something interesting is about to happen. He said, "Sarah, I have a case for you if you're interested," and proceeded to explain that an important client, a tech company, was being sued for unfair labor practices and needed representation. "But there's one detail," Peter said. "The plaintiff company is being represented by Montgomery and Associates." My stomach clenched because I knew exactly what that meant. I was going to face Dad and Connor in court. Peter looked at me and said, "I'll completely understand if you'd rather not take the case. I know it's complicated, but honestly, I think you're the best lawyer for this. And our client deserves the best representation possible." I told him I needed to think about it, that I'd give him an answer in a couple of days. That night, I couldn't sleep again. My mind was racing with all the implications. On one hand, this was exactly the opportunity I needed to prove what I was worth, to show Dad he had made a mistake. On the other hand, suing your own father's firm, facing your family in court, that was another level of conflict. I called a friend from college, someone who knew the whole situation, and told her about it. She said something that helped me decide. She said, "Sarah, if your father had valued your talent from the beginning, none of this would be happening. This situation is a consequence of his decisions, not yours." 2 days later, I walked into Peter's office and told him, "I accept the case. Let's do it." He shook my hand and said, "You're going to be incredible." We spent the next few weeks preparing, reviewing every detail, building our strategy. The case was solid. We had clear evidence that the plaintiff company had violated multiple contractual clauses. They had fired employees without just cause. They had created a hostile work environment. Montgomery and Associates was representing the company and, according to my research, Connor was personally leading the case. Dad probably thought it would be good experience for him. A relatively simple case he could win easily. They didn't know I would be on the other side. The day of the first hearing arrived. I put on my most professional suit, a navy blue ensemble that made me feel powerful, and arrived at court half an hour early. I was reviewing my notes when I saw them come in. Dad and Connor with 2 more associates from the firm. Dad saw me first, stopped dead in his tracks, and the expression on his face was total shock. Connor said something like, "What is she doing here?" And one of the associates must have explained that I was the opposing counsel's lawyer, because I saw Connor's face go from confusion to something like panic. Dad tried to approach, but the judge came in at that moment, and we all had to take our places. To the hearing was, I don't know how to describe it, like surreal, but also incredibly satisfying. Connor presented his arguments first, and it was painful to watch. Honestly, he stuttered. Didn't have his facts straight. The judge had to ask him to clarify several points. When it was my turn, I stood up, presented our case with clarity and precision, every argument backed with solid evidence, every objection technically perfect. I saw Dad taking notes furiously, probably realizing how poorly prepared Connor was for this level of litigation. The judge gave us 2 weeks to submit additional documentation and scheduled the next session. I left the courthouse feeling a strange mix of triumph and sadness. Dad tried to catch up with me in the parking lot, called out to me, said, "Sarah, please, we need to talk about this." But I kept walking. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. When I got to the office, Peter was waiting for me with a huge smile, told me I had been magnificent, that I had dominated the room, and for the first time in months I felt that someone really appreciated my work. The next 3 sessions were basically me dismantling every argument Connor tried to build. It wasn't personal against him. Well, maybe a little, but mainly it was doing my job in the best way possible. In the 3rd session, Connor made a rookie mistake, cited a case that actually supported our position, not theirs, and I pointed it out immediately. I saw Dad close his eyes as if it physically hurt him to see his son screw up that badly. The judge started showing clear inclination. Toward our position? Asked Connor harder questions, accepted my objections almost automatically. By the fourth session, I already knew we were going to win. It was just a matter of how bad Montgomery and Associates was going to look in the process. Peter asked me if I wanted to try to reach a settlement. Said Dad would probably be willing to negotiate to avoid a total public defeat. I told him to talk to them, to see what they offered. 2 days later, Dad called Peter directly. They offered a settlement that was basically giving us everything we asked for. They admitted partial responsibility, paid generous compensation to our client. Technically, it was a total victory for us. The day we signed the settlement was strange. We all had to meet in a conference room to make all the paperwork official. Dad and Connor arrived with their associates, all with funeral faces. The process was mechanical. We signed documents, exchanged copies. There were some forced handshakes. When it was over, Dad and Connor left without saying anything to me. They literally walked out of the room without looking at me. The associates from my firm surrounded me, congratulating me. Peter said it was the best work he had seen from a young lawyer in years. But I felt a strange emptiness in my chest, like I had won the battle, but lost something bigger in the process. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, my assistant informed me that Howard Montgomery was in reception, asking if he could see me. I told her to let him in. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity? Maybe a part of me still hoped for something. Dad came into my office. He looked older than I remembered, tired. He sat down without being invited and stayed quiet for a moment that felt eternal. Finally, he said, "I came to apologize, Sarah." And I didn't say anything, just looked at him, waiting for him to continue. He said he had been wrong, that he had underestimated me, that what I did in that courtroom opened his eyes in a way nothing else could have. He said, "Connor isn't ready to run the firm. Maybe he never will be. And I was a fool to think gender mattered more than talent. It was what I had wanted to hear for months. Years, maybe. But now that I was hearing it, I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. I just felt tired." I asked him, "So, what do you want, Dad?" And he said, "I want you to come back. I want to offer you the position that should have always been yours, senior partner at Montgomery and Associates." And I laughed. Not with joy, but with something like disbelief. I told him, "Do you really think that after all this I'm going to come back? After you told me I wasn't enough? After you chose Connor over me? After I had to prove my worth by destroying your case in court?" He tried to argue that we could start over, that we could rebuild our relationship, but I interrupted him. I told him, "I need time to think. I can't give you an answer right now." Dad nodded, got up slowly, and before leaving he said, "Regardless of what you decide, I want you to know I'm proud of you, of the lawyer you've become, of your strength, of your integrity." And he left, leaving me alone in my office with an impossible decision ahead. On one hand, Montgomery and Associates was my legacy, my childhood dream come true, the opportunity to run one of the most prestigious firms in Dallas. On the other hand, I had found genuine respect and appreciation at Hartman and Associates. I had built something on my own. I had proven I didn't need the Montgomery name to be an exceptional lawyer. 3 weeks have passed since that conversation with Dad. He calls me every couple of days, always with some excuse, that he needs my opinion on a case, that he wants to invite me to dinner, that Mom misses me. Connor sent me a long email apologizing, saying he should have declined Dad's offer from the beginning, that he always knew I was the better lawyer, that he hopes we can have a relationship someday. I haven't responded yet. I don't know what to tell him. Peter told me that whatever decision I make will have his support, but he also confessed he'd prefer I stay, that he sees me as the future of this firm. I don't know what I'm going to do. Honestly, every day I change my mind like 10 times. There's a part of me that wants to accept Dad's offer, prove I can run Montgomery and Associates better than him, and certainly better than Connor. But there's also a part that feels going back would betray everything I fought for, would send the message that in the end what Dad thinks matters more than my own dignity. I guess what I learned from all this is that sometimes victories don't feel like you expected. Sometimes winning means losing other things, and that recognition that comes late hurts in a different way than recognition that never comes. Last week, a new client came to see me. A woman in her 30s who's being discriminated against at her job by a boss who thinks women can't handle important accounts. As she told me her story, I felt something familiar. That righteous anger I knew so well. I told her I'd take her case, that we would fight and win. And when she left my office, I found myself thinking that maybe that's my place, representing people who need someone to fight for them, proving case by case that gender doesn't define ability. Maybe I don't need the Montgomery name on my office door to make a difference, but I still haven't given Dad a final answer. And honestly, I don't know when I'll be able to. What I do know is that whatever my decision is, it will be mine, based on what I want, not on what's expected of me or on pleasing my family. And I think that, more than any title or position, is the real triumph of this whole situation.